The moment Joanie Lamb sat down on Daystar's table talk to address the controversies swirling around her and the network, what was meant to be a clarifying moment instead ignited even more criticism and suspicion. The conversation she presented, filled with spiritual language, heartfelt tones, and biblical references, was not received as a moment of healing transparency. Instead, it was met with outrage, with critics and even former supporters accusing her of using faith as a shield to deflect responsibility and silence the voices that dared to raise serious concerns. It was one of those moments that defined not just her leadership but also the future credibility of Daystar. And before we go any further, if you want to keep getting the raw, unfiltered truth about stories like this, hit the subscribe button now and turn on your bell notification. You'll be the first to hear the latest developments in this story and many others shaking the world of faith and leadership. When Joanie chose to address the controversy, there was an expectation that honesty and clarity would take center stage. Instead, many walked away feeling like accountability was once again evaded. What should have been direct answers turned into spiritual phrasing about God's sovereignty, forgiveness, and perseverance. To her critics, this wasn't just disappointing, it was manipulative. The appearance of vulnerability felt more like a calculated attempt to regain control of the narrative rather than an open invitation to seek truth. Commentators argued that Joanie leaned heavily on religious language that made questioning her seem like questioning God himself, a tactic often used by leaders in crisis to close down debate. This approach fueled the perception that Daystar was not interested in transparency but in damage control, further polarizing its audience and raising deeper questions about whether integrity could still be found within the ministry. For many, it was not the faith she referenced that became the problem but how it was weaponized to insulate herself and the institution she leads. The controversy deepened when allegations of abuse within the Lamb family surfaced, allegations that cut straight to the heart of everything Daystar claimed to stand for. Jonathan Lamb, Joanie's own son, alongside his wife Susie, accused her of covering up abuse involving their young daughter. This wasn't a distant or external scandal, it was deeply personal, tied to their own family, and it placed Joanie in the devastating position of being accused not just of mishandling a crisis but of protecting the institution at the expense of a child. The public was stunned, and the fact that such an allegation could even exist in this context shook people's trust to its core. Ministries and churches are supposed to be safe places for the vulnerable, yet here was a story suggesting that image and reputation took priority over protecting the innocent. Whether the allegations were proven or not, the emotional damage and the perception of betrayal were already immense. Jonathan further claimed that Daystar pressured him to remain silent, even pushing for him to sign a non-disclosure agreement. To anyone following the story, this claim was explosive because it fit into a troubling pattern seen across institutions, where the machinery of protection is not for victims but for leadership. If true, it meant Daystar valued silence and control over truth and justice. For Jonathan and Susie, this wasn't just a disagreement over leadership styles or ministry direction. This was about their daughter's safety, about whether the institution could be trusted with its most vulnerable. Jonathan's claims placed Joanie and Daystar in the spotlight in ways they had never been before, intensifying the demand for answers and accountability. In response, Daystar issued its own explanation, firmly denying wrongdoing and framing Jonathan's dismissal as tied to performance issues rather than his whistleblowing. They insisted that the narrative Jonathan presented was misleading and damaging, portraying themselves as victims of a bitter family dispute. Yet, while the institution tried to present itself as wrongfully accused, law enforcement took enough interest in the allegations to reopen the case. That reopening was significant, signaling that even authorities felt the claims deserved a second look. Though the investigation eventually closed without charges being filed, the damage was already done. Public trust is far more fragile than legal outcomes, and for many viewers, donors, and ministry partners, the fact that such allegations had to be investigated at all raised doubts about the moral compass guiding Daystar's leadership. Even as the abuse case subsided legally, the controversies didn't stop there. Financial integrity became the next lightning rod, as reports surfaced alleging that $100,000 in ministry funds had been used to cover Joanie's honeymoon expenses. For critics, this was not just an ethical slip, it was evidence of a pattern of blurred lines between personal luxury and ministry stewardship. Donors give with the expectation that their contributions fuel ministry, outreach, and the spreading of the gospel, not private getaways. The fact that such a large sum could be tied to personal benefit sent shockwaves through the community of supporters, many of whom began to openly question how responsibly Daystar was managing its finances. Adding fuel to the fire were reports that Joanie's salary had seen significant increases following the death of her husband, Marcus Lamb. While it is not unusual for leadership salaries to shift after major changes in an organization, the optics of the situation, especially given the ongoing scandals, were disastrous. The timing made it appear as though Joanie was capitalizing on tragedy and turmoil to secure greater financial benefit. For critics, this wasn't simply about numbers on a paycheck, it was about trust, about whether Daystar was still functioning as a ministry or had fully transformed into a family-run empire prioritizing self-preservation and financial gain over service and transparency. As the weight of these scandals grew heavier, ministries and Christian leaders began distancing themselves from Daystar. Joyce Meyer, one of the most prominent Christian voices and a longtime partner with the network, recently announced a pause in her programming, directly citing the troubling allegations as a reason to step away. Others, like Laurelyn Tyler Thompson and Baruch Corman, severed ties earlier, citing ethical concerns and a lack of confidence in Daystar's ability to uphold God's standards. Each departure sent another ripple through the Christian broadcasting world, underscoring just how damaging the ongoing controversies had become. When respected leaders no longer feel safe affiliating with a platform, it signals to the wider faith community that something is deeply broken. At the heart of all this, critics pointed to a consistent theme: the use of faith language to avoid accountability. Joanie's appeals to prayer, forgiveness, and trusting God, while sincere to some ears, sounded to others like evasions designed to quiet dissent and shield leadership from hard questions. This tactic, spiritualizing criticism, has long been noted in religious institutions facing scandal, where questioning leadership is framed as a lack of faith or even rebellion against God's will. In this context, it only deepened the perception that Daystar was unwilling to confront its failings head-on. For many believers watching from the outside, this dynamic was heartbreaking, because it represented a distortion of faith, turning spiritual language into a weapon against truth rather than a pathway toward it. The takeaways from this unfolding saga are painfully clear. First, spiritual rhetoric, no matter how moving, cannot replace transparency and accountability. When it is misused to silence concerns, it does harm not just to individuals but to the witness of the church as a whole. Second, allegations of abuse, even those that don't lead to charges, must always be handled with the utmost care, prioritizing the voices and needs of victims over the protection of reputations. Third, financial integrity in ministries cannot be optional, it requires independent oversight and openness that ensures donor trust is never compromised. Fourth, vague spiritual explanations cannot restore trust when clear accountability is what people long for. And finally, genuine healing in the church, whether for Daystar, the Lamb family, or anyone involved, can only begin with truth, repentance, and transparency. Without those elements, the cycle of mistrust, manipulation, and damage will only continue. This is not just a story about Joanie Lamb, Daystar, or even one family in crisis. It is a reflection of broader questions facing faith communities everywhere. How do we hold leaders accountable? How do we protect the vulnerable? And how do we ensure that the language of faith is used to bring healing and justice, not to shield wrongdoing? These are the questions that will linger long after the headlines fade, and they are the questions every believer must wrestle with in their own heart. So as this story continues to unfold, stay with us for every development. Make sure you are subscribed and your notifications are turned on, because this is one story that's not going away anytime soon. The fight for truth, accountability, and integrity in the church is too important to ignore, and together we must keep shining light into the darkness, no matter how uncomfortable it may be.